Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our second listening session on use of force policy. Before we get started, I'd like to run over a few housekeeping items so you know how to participate in today's event. First, all lines are on mute. And if you experience any technical difficulties at any point during our presentation, please explain your problem through the chat feature and we will try our best to address the issue. Next, we are recording this meeting and the video will be available on our YouTube page within 24 hours. Please subscribe to New Jersey OAG on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Flickr for the latest updates on resources, news, and information from our office. And now I'd like to introduce our host and moderator for today, New Jersey Attorney General Gurbir Grewal.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm New Jersey Attorney General Gurbir Grewal, and it's my privilege to welcome you to part 2 of our virtual listening session on the use of force revision process that's underway here in New Jersey. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, a bit of background. Back in June, I announced that we were starting the process of revising our state's use of force policy, which applies to 500 plus police departments and 36,000 plus law enforcement officers in our state. This is the first revision to this policy in over 2 decades. And we're absolutely committed to getting it right. And to get it right, we need robust community engagement and input. Over the last several months, prosecutors around the state have been holding listening sessions like this one. And today's session is a continuation of a conversation that we started back on June 24th. Due to the overwhelming responses to our first session, and because we couldn't get to all of your questions during that session, our panelists agreed to return today to address your concerns. Because we had over 100 questions and comments pending, we've done our best to combine these questions and comments that we received from the public. And our panelists will try to move through as many of them as possible during today's session. I want to thank them for returning, and briefly, I'd like to introduce our panelists once again. Today, we're joined by Giles Schitt. Giles is a commissioner of the New Jersey Police Training Commission and president of the New Jersey chapter of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, also known as NOBLE. He's a past national leader for the same organization. Kuvella Spruill is the director of public safety for the Franklin Township Police Department and executive vice president of the New Jersey chapter of NOBLE. She's the former chief of detectives for the Essex County Prosecutor's Office, and I'm told today was elected to the national board of NOBLE as its financial secretary. So thank you and congratulations to Q, who gets sworn in into that new role this evening. We're also joined by Jonathan Parham, who's the current director of countywide policy, police policy planning and training in the Union County Prosecutor's Office. And prior to that role, he served as the police chief of the Linden, New Jersey Police Department. Welcome to all of you. And I don't want to waste any valuable time that we have. And I just want to start going through the questions that we compiled after our last session. And so I want to start with our first question, and I want to direct it to Director Spruill, now National Board Member of NOBLE, Financial Secretary of NOBLE. Congratulations and welcome.
Thank you.
The first question we received that'll go to you is pretty much a common one that we receive on the complaint process. And the viewer asks, can a civilian make a complaint against any officer if they feel that they've been targeted because of their race? And if so, how can someone make this type of complaint?
So it's not a new process. It's always been a process where if a civilian felt that there was a misconduct by the officer, whether it's a demeanor complaint or something criminal, they could make a complaint to the local police department, to their internal affairs, or if they didn't feel comfortable doing that, they can go to that county's prosecutor's office, internal affairs, or professional standards and make that complaint. Or if they don't feel comfortable doing that, they can also contact the Attorney General's office and make their complaint. And there's a process in place, and the information is online where a civilian can make a complaint anytime, any place, anywhere, anonymous, in writing, on the telephone. And one of the important things is that civilians believe, oh, nothing will happen. But just like your driving record or a criminal history, when you make that complaint, whether or not it's sustained that time or not, it stays on the officer's record. So sometimes the first time, maybe there's not enough proof, but if multiple people are complaining about the same officer, it builds a pattern. And one of the other good things that come out of you making a complaint, it forces that department, it forces the supervisors to look at that officer's work, whether that be reviewing the body cams or the dash cams or their reporting process. So it forces a certain level of monitoring of that officer. So I encourage everyone to make a complaint. If you just feel it, you can't prove it, you can feel it, make the complaint.
That the answer you gave, Q, I think hit on a point which we often hear from members of the public, that it won't make a difference. But sometimes the piece of information that you might have to offer, you might not think is that significant, but really gives you some pause, and you make that complaint, or you share that piece of information, and it sometimes fits in with a larger pattern that a police executive, a chief, a director might be seeing with the particular officer, and might force a meaningful review. So it's always meaningful for members of the public to make complaints, as Q outlined. There are many mechanisms by which you could do it, and it is followed up on. It's required to be followed up on, and the public should have confidence that you have law enforcement executives like the director who take this seriously all across our state and want to get things right. And so thank you for that answer. I want to move to another question, or category of questions that we received about police training. And we consolidated a number of them. And I want to throw this out to former Chief Parham about police training. And the question, and really it's a number of questions distilled into one, is that do police officers have a yearly continuing education requirement? And if so, who teaches those courses? And can they be taught by outside entities? Chief?
Thank you for having me on, sir. To answer that question, there are a couple of training venues that law enforcement in New Jersey are required to do. In 2016, Attorney General Perino looked at the Community Law Enforcement Assistance Affirmative Relations Continuing Education Initiative, CLEAR Institute, and from that, they determined that law enforcement needed to have recurring training and have credit requirements for law enforcement to make sure that they were having good and great relationships with the community, but having the skill sets to do so require them to do continuing education. In addition to that, the Attorney General guidelines require certain mandatory trainings based on your assignment to happen every year, whether it's domestic violence or conflict de-escalation, CPR. There are a number of things that are required. Law enforcement normally teaches law enforcement. With the CLEAR Institute, there are some people from outside of law enforcement that approve the training and come up with basically a library of training initiatives that need to be trained. The county prosecutors are involved. For the state police, the superintendent is involved in selecting the curriculum. But there is definitely a continuing education requirement of 3 credits per year for each law enforcement officer to continue to update their training to ensure that they have competencies and skill sets to address the things that they would see on the road.
And this is obviously in addition to everything everyone receives in service in the academies, I mean pre-service rather, but this builds on all that teaching. You're an expert in this area, and I wanted to talk about scenario-based trainings because we got some questions about that with respect to use of force. Do you think that there should be more periodic and annual refresher use of force trainings that are scenario-based? And before you answer that, Chief, if you could just tell the viewers what scenario-based training is and what scenario-based training entails as opposed to other types of trainings.
So scenario-based training really looks at the types of incidents that occur most frequently for law enforcement officers, the things that they normally see on a consistent basis, and how we can utilize the techniques and the tactics that we currently teach to fit into those methods of training into those particular incidents. So if it's a car stop, or if it's dealing with a mentally ill person, or dealing with someone on a domestic violence, those particular incidents have certain nuances that are attached. They require certain types of responses. If we repetitively go through those things with a law enforcement officer, we build up a type of normalcy for them to see, not to the point where they're complacent, but where they're not overly surprised. It's the act of being surprised that makes the action of the law enforcement officer kind of unpredictable. If we are able to recreate the scenarios that law enforcement officers more than likely get into every day and provide them with good training on how to properly assess them and how to mitigate them, then we can pretty much ensure that the outcome will be favorable. This training is probably the best type of training that's out there, because it not only involves the mental acuity of the officer, them understanding how to use policy, kinesthetically, they get their muscles involved, they get to think, they get to sweat, they get to feel the incident, and most correctly mimics what they're actually going to see in the operating environment. Normally what happens in the academy environment, a lot of it is done through lecture. The officer or the recruit sits in the classroom, someone speaks to them for hours on end, they refer to textbooks, and while they may get an understanding cerebrally, they don't get any type of repetition built up in their body. They don't get to fully understand how all of those things work together. Scenario-based training does the best of all of that. It recognizes that you have a body of knowledge that you're bringing to the situation. You repetitively drill this particular situation so that for the most part, more often than not, you're going to cover everything that could happen, which could ensure a favorable outcome. It also works on contingencies. What are the possible list of things that could go wrong for this particular incident? And let's drill those as well. So the contingencies are just as important, if not more so, than the initial incident that's being covered.
I'm going to circle back a little bit later in our conversation about body cams and how body cams can be used for scenario-based training. But I do want to turn to Giles before we get back to training to talk about policing oversight. Giles, you've been involved in law enforcement at various different levels throughout your career. You're currently a commissioner with the Police Training Commission. We've received a number of questions about creating a mechanism for effective police oversight in New Jersey. One of the viewers asked, is there a way we can create a New Jersey Policing Oversight Commission that's independent, non-biased, where both civilians and officers can report police misconduct and which can properly and independently investigate such complaints? Do you have thoughts about this type of policing oversight mechanism and the feasibility of it in New Jersey?
Sure, absolutely. And one of the things that your office has already started on, and I think we can expound upon, is the Office of Public Integrity and Accountability. That's a way I think we need more community input with that specific office, but that office is structured in a way now that it can bring about that type of accountability. As I said, there's some expansion we can do, but absolutely. And that would address it on a statewide basis. The Attorney General's office is one of the most independent bodies in this state as it relates to policing. And so that would be a good place to start it from. Additionally, local townships, municipalities can also look at CRBs, more so civilian review boards. And I believe one is underway in Newark now. And from everything that I hear from Director Ambrose and Mayor Raz Baraka, he testified last week at a Senate hearing. They're moving forward with some things. You know, one thing we always have to remember in policing, we police at the consent of the people. And the more transparency, if we want to continue to build on trust, we have to do that along with transparency. And the people that we serve have to be a part of the process. Otherwise, this process doesn't work. Sir Robert Peel, who's known as the father of modern day policing, always said, the people are the police and the police are the people. So we have to open up. We cannot be an environment that appears to be closed. And we, you know, at any opportunity we get, we have to include the community in the process. And that's from the top right down to the bottom.
You know, I think a couple of the points you made, you know, are worth teasing out a little bit because, you know, OPIA, the Office of Public Integrity and Accountability, has that statewide oversight function, which it could have over the various IA functions, the internal affairs functions of different departments, and reviewing and making sure people are adhering to the rules of the road when it comes to IAs. That always has to stay there. You always need a robust IA process. These oversight commissions that we're talking about, whether it's a CRB or a statewide commission, that's in addition to that traditional internal affairs and discipline function, correct?
That's absolutely right. And that oversight, the majority of organizations have boards of educations have oversight, which in doctors have some board to review them. We have to, and quite frankly, if we're not doing that, we're kind of missing the point, because we should be evaluating what we do all the time. It doesn't have to be utilized for disciplinary reasons. It could
Policy
be utilized
review.
for, it could be, exactly, it could be utilized for, are we engaging the community enough? Are we giving the proper customer service to the residents that we serve? So it shouldn't be looked at as in a negative vein. It should be looked at as something that's going to enhance the delivery of services that we give to our community.
And I think that's important. You know, this is just an additional level of input, an additional level even of scrutiny. And I think we should embrace it. And I think at the end of the day, use it as a means to improve, you know, where we might not be seeing things in the community, may be able to highlight areas where we're missing or gaps in trust. And so I like the way you framed your answer, because it really sheds light that this is not just for discipline. It's also to move forward in meaningful policy and also to engage community members. On a related note, we have questions about accountability. And so I want to ask you, and I'll go to Q first and come back to you, Giles, about sort of the duty to report and the duty to intervene that exists in law enforcement. The viewer asks, we know that there are existing guidelines already. You know, we're in the process of revising them, but there are existing use of force guidelines and requirements for other officers to report abuses and intervene. But can you elaborate about police culture and about how it may make such reporting difficult and prevent officers from intervening? How does the state address complaints made by officers concerning fellow officers and help prevent that officer from being ostracized because of, quote, clique culture that might be existing in law enforcement agencies? It's a tough question. It's something that we all contend with, but I'd be interested to hearing your views. And really, I'd open it up to the panel on this broad question.
So one of the first things about that is there are mechanisms in place. And I find, though, that, you know, with internal affairs, with the AG's office, OPI, there are dedicated people that work in those departments. And, you know, I've known them to do the right thing when it comes to other officers reporting misconduct within their department, because they're required to report a crime happening on the street. They're also required by policies and procedures to report crimes that are happening internally, and also rules that are not being followed. So they're supposed to be accountable to each other. However, the culture set where officers may be reluctant to do so because they're afraid that their officers are not going to back them up if they're known as the person who is, say, the snitch or the rat or things like that. Harassment can occur. And to my side of seeing this, it starts at the frontline supervisors. We have to require and train the frontline supervisors to protect those officers that come to them with this information. They should be shielded just like a domestic violence victim when they come and they report such misconduct, because it can prevent further abuse, it can prevent further corruption and misconduct and inappropriate actions and policies and practices in the department early on. So those younger officers, those more reluctant officers, they need to be protected by frontline supervisors and ultimately the chiefs and directors, because if the head enforces it and monitors it and follows up with it, that is what is going to make significant change when it filters down from the head down to the frontline supervisors and through the department.
And I think another area where we're trying to do more there is through offering better training for those supervisors to nurture that kind of environment. And I think that's certainly a gap in an area where we could do more work. But Giles and Jonathan, any thoughts on how you encourage that type of reporting and you protect officers who do step forward? Really, it's a question about changing culture, I think.
Yes, sir. One additional thing I'd like to add is and it's a hard reality, is that each law enforcement officer is responsible for doing the right thing. I don't want to make it seem like the officers have an out just because their culture is one that does not support them advising a supervisor when the officer views something wrong. The officer on an individual basis is responsible for notifying someone and actually physically stepping in to stop that course of action that may be improper or, God forbid, illegal. So, but before we move on, everyone needs to know that we expect that at the officer level. But to the extent where the agency, the organization, and even the institution of law enforcement contribute to that culture is consider how we train our law enforcement officers. We take them from different parts of the community and we bring them in, and we openly tell them that we want them to remove their identity and look like us and dress like us and speak like us and act like us. There's a socialization process that basically tells them you are no longer you are one of us. When that group dynamic and that group mindset starts to happen, it is inevitable that that if they see something, they will not want to tell on one of us. They don't want to get one of us in trouble. This is the way we do things here. All of those types of conversations happen, but not in and of themselves. They are assisted by the way we train. They're assisted by the way that we socialize our officers. They're assisted by the way we dress and the way we speak. And they're also assisted by the fact that there's not a whole lot of discussion about this at the academy. Surely it is mentioned, but it is not an overwhelming discussion that happens repetitively to the point where people understand, not because you're going to get in trouble, but because you do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. That's the mantra of that law enforcement is in a lot of places, but it needs to be expressed more. Our number one mantra, the one thing that every law enforcement officer, no matter how long they've been on the job, can tell you is the most important thing is to go home safe at the end of the night. If that becomes the only thing that we remember, then we tend to believe that as long as we go home safe, everything else is okay. Any other way that we carry out our job is on the table. That's where we have the disparities. That's where we have the problems. It is that culture, and culture just isn't the chief and the sergeants. It is also the police academy. It's the prosecutor's office. It's the agencies. It is how we message what is important to law enforcement. And if we think integrity is important, then it ought to be stated a lot more than it has been.
Yes,
Giles, let me turn to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to add on to that, Jonathan and Q made some really valid points. But additionally, what we have to make sure, I mean, we've came a long way since Serpico, the NAP Commission, the Kerner Commission,
Yep.
and we have made a lot of advancements in law enforcement, but we're still not where we need to be yet. And I would be less than honest if I would say that we were. So we have to put in place whatever mechanisms necessary to make sure that when people come forward, the vast majority of cops I know don't like bad cops. All right? And I'll tell you the reason why, because it tarnishes the badge of all of the good cops who are out there working day and night to service the people the proper way, the way we were taught to, the way we were trained to, with empathy for others. And quite frankly, there's not many chiefs that I know that want a bad officer working for them, because that's one other problem. Being a former director, I know you have to deal with councils, you have to deal with mayors, city administrators, you have unions, you have community members, other groups that you're dealing with. And the last thing I need is somebody I'm paying a livable wage to be giving me a hard time. So whatever mechanisms we can put in place, and we're working on that now with the committees that you form through your office. But we have to make sure that that officer, he or she that comes forward with information or evidence on bad policing or wants to report a bad officer, that they're protected, whether it's through the whistleblower statute or whatever we have to put in place. It's critically important that we have to do that. So the other officers who are out in the street day in and day out doing the right thing are not tarnished, or badges are not tarnished. And also too, it gives that department, it'll take you one bad officer in your department can take you over 20 years to recover and to regain the public's trust. So we have to make sure there's mechanisms in place, and we have to be, we can't deal with this in a Pollyanna way. We have to be very swift and certain with our addressing this issue.
Go ahead, Q.
So, and absolutely, I agree with both Jonathan and Giles. And something else that comes up is, even if we start with an 8-hour block in a police academy, it is going to be definitely the department's responsibility to have the supervisors trained properly. I think I said this last time, nowhere in the United States do we hand over millions of dollars of resources. A business would never do it and not properly train personnel. They're not properly trained in certain areas. I mean, we focus on use of force, we focus on certain practices, but the reality is 80% of the job is communicating and dealing with people. That is not presented in our training. That would start right there. We start with supervisors taking a test, but guess what? Most of that testing is not on how do you deal with employees, employment law, HR, identifying issues with employees. So it starts there. We're going to have to continue it, start it at the academy, continue it throughout the entire process. And one of the things that we're doing here, our supervisors have to go to a management coach. I mean, it's kind of corporate thinking, but guess what? They sit down and they dig in, they do the DISC assessment. We learn, you know, what type of personality they have, and that's forwarded to their supervisors. I had to do one to start here so that the town manager and HR could see who I was, and I had to sit with the coach also.
A couple of things that I just want to summarize from what I just heard. One, I think the public should be heartened to know that we have a former chief, former director, current director, all who have been working towards these types of improvements in their departments. And I just left a meeting with the New Jersey State Association of Chiefs of Police. And for about 2 hours, we were talking about strategies at a statewide level on how we could continue to improve on this issue, on creating a culture of accountability, because that's what it comes down to. We need to strengthen the culture of accountability that exists in all of our departments in some way or another. But we strengthen it, as all of the speakers just said, by looking at new training programs to make it clear to recruits at the very beginning, like we do on so many other things, that confronting improper behaviors Jonathan was talking about, and as Q and Giles were talking about, that confronting improper behavior by other officers is a key part of their job, that there are proven training strategies to help change culture, and proven evaluation models and management training models that are out there. And it is the public should be heartened to hear that directors such as yourself, chiefs across the state, are looking at these models. It's not a one size fits all, but we need to start talking about it, to start developing that type of culture from day one of training and continuing throughout an officer's career, particularly when they become supervisors. I'm going to move on to an issue that's sort of front and center, which is almost related, but it's an issue of transparency. And the question, I think, is probably directed to me. And the question is, what is your response to the PBA statement that each police force in New Jersey has its own standards for discipline, and that's why it's not fair to publish statewide reports of discipline? Is there a way to create a transparency system that specifies the actual infractions committed by police officers on a list rather than categories of disciplinary actions? It'd be more valuable to the public and to police departments. Just by way of just a brief background, we issued 2 directives in June that required additional transparency when it came to officer disciplinary records and disciplinary histories, that issues of major discipline, suspensions of greater than 5 days, issues where officers were fired or demoted, that summaries of this information should be made public, and that we should be transparent about it. It was a small step towards transparency. There are greater steps being considered right now in the legislature, but this is, again, to help foster that culture of accountability that we're talking about in the prior questions and answers that we've just gone through. It's true that not every police department treats every instance or infraction exactly the same way, but I don't think that means that the standard for deciding which officers to identify is too broad. Again, we set a baseline. It's my hope that as we begin to become more transparent, that we specify the infractions, we give a summary of the infractions so the public has some context. And up until now, for the state police and other agencies at the AG's office, we would provide anonymous summaries. But the goal is, as we're moving forward, if we put names attendant to these types of reports, and there's a department in a particular county that issues this report, and year after year, you see the same officer on those reports, then members of the public can rightfully go and talk to the chief and hold them accountable and say, why is this officer still employed by you? Why aren't you doing more to hold them accountable? Why are they still on the force? And it's an added layer of accountability that we believe will serve to have a deterrent effect, will in the process build trust with the public, and again, try to foster this culture of accountability that we're trying to develop in this state. I'd say, as a final point, we lead on so many issues in this state. This is an area where we have to catch up to at least a half a dozen to 24 other states that have a degree more of transparency on these types of issues. So I think that one was directed at me. I'll move on to circle back to our training expert, Chief Parham, unless anybody wants to jump in on transparency and discipline records. Jonathan?
I'll just add a quick point. You know, I think about the franchise model. You know, if you go to Germany and you go to McDonald's, or you go to Georgia and you go to McDonald's, you're going to get the same thing. And the reason why that's important is that it creates consistency and predictability equals trust. I trust that the same food that I eat in one state is going to be the same taste that I experience in another country. While I'm not suggesting that the internal affairs model is the same in every department, the IA guideline does suggest that you come up with a menu, an infraction menu that says, for this type of offense, you will get this type of punishment or this type of response or however. The reason that's important is that it reduces the idea of discretion. It takes away the idea that you get to say, well, you know, for this case, it wasn't that bad, and they do a lot of other good work, so I'll give them this. The ability for everyone in the entire agency before on January 1st to know that if they commit an infraction of a particular nature on December 31st, they're going to get a specific punishment, and everyone gets the same thing. While we may not like the actual discipline, we know that it is consistently applied. That franchise model, that consistency breeds trust in the organization, and it takes away the idea that I'm getting treated different from someone else because of my relationship, either good or bad, with the people that are doing the investigating.
That's a fantastic point. And I think it also level sets too, as you're seeing more of these reports, or as you begin to see this type of transparency, hopefully you'll see more consistency in the disciplinary process, and see, you know, that if there are outliers in some departments where they might be treating a certain type of infraction in a certain way, that we bring some degree of uniformity to it, whether it's you know, through the type of discipline we're meting out, or how we're characterizing it. But at the end of the day, to me, it's about public trust. To me, it's about seeing what works in other states. I was on the phone the other day with police chiefs from Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Tennessee, who have had this type of model for years, and it works. And it works in making sure that if someone does transgress or cross a line, they're held accountable, and the public sees that they're held accountable. But when we're opaque and we have no visibility into this, the public is left to wonder how we're disciplining particular officers and how we're working to prevent trends and problematic behavior from continuing. And again, this is just part of it, because to really address these issues, we also have to have our early intervention systems. We also have to have our resiliency programs, where if we're seeing problematic trends at the front end, we want to work to correct it. We want to track different types of data, use of force. If we see somebody who's an outlier, we want to work to correct it. But if they cross lines and are disciplined, the public has a right to know. But it's my hope that we never get to that point because of our investment in all these other programs to include recruiting, training, and other modes of accountability. So before I move on, I just want to offer Q and Giles a chance to comment on those issues.
I just like to say, you're right. And the reality is, before you get to a major discipline, that we're talking about reporting, most times the officers have done other things that led to that. So I think the early intervention and the early warning system and the supervision, that helps, because you don't most times get to a major discipline infraction from an officer if there weren't small things that led to that officer having that larger infraction. There are exceptions, as always, but I think the biggest part is to watch the little things that add up. The 4, the 5 demeanor complaints, the lateness, the regular employee issues, and the minor infractions. I think that's also important before we get to the major one. And like Jonathan said, guess what? Some chiefs and directors and leaders of departments, they need that menu because, quite frankly, they don't divvy out the same discipline, because they may feel, well, this officer is a great such and such officer, and they don't want to give them that type of hit, as they call it. So I think it's important that, we do that as well.
And just to go back on your transparency statement, General, we have to. We talked about this the last time we were on the panel, and law enforcement leaders of law enforcement agencies need to know before someone comes in their door, knocking on their door for another job, they need to know what's that individual's history. What good would it do us to transfer one department's problem to another department? We need to know, and the public, quite frankly, has a right to know if a person who's been involved in a number of cases of major disciplines, that should be a part of the transparency. Again, that's going to lead to more trust and making sure the community continues to look at law enforcement agencies as being legitimate. Because as I always say, if we lose that legitimacy, then we cannot be effective in the policing that we need to do every day. As I said, always, we need the community and the community needs the police. I'll tell you why police need the community, because not only morally is that the right thing that we should be doing, but also additionally, you cannot put a police officer on every street. The community has to come to us with information that's going on as it relates to crime problems. And we also need those individuals to serve on juries, and we need them to turn just verdicts. So it's critically important that we have the trust, and the best way that we can get trust from that community and maintain that trust is through transparency.
It seems like it's deja vu all over again. If we look at where we were in law enforcement after Ferguson in 2013, moving forward to President Obama's task force on 21st century policing, that's the first pillar. The first pillar is to have that trust and to have that legitimacy, and transparency helps build that. The vast majority of officers are going to go throughout their entire careers with never having one of these infractions. But there are those few that fall short, and even those that fall short then correct their behavior and move on to have meaningful careers. I've promoted people personally who have been the recipients of major discipline over my career, but they have turned their careers around. And I think that's an important point to note here. Some have not, and they're dealt with. But I think the public, when you're not transparent, when you're opaque and you guard the small number of officers that fall short, again, it's not a huge number, it's a very small percentage, it creates and widens that distrust. And right now we should be doubling down on how to bridge those chasms, because that legitimacy is going to lead to safer communities, like you alluded to, Giles, because people will feel more comfortable cooperating in investigations, coming forward at trial, serving on juries. And at the end of the day, that's good for public safety, it's good for law enforcement safety, and it's good to move the profession forward. So thank you for raising all of those points. I'm going to switch gears again to go back to some training questions, and I'm going to kick it to Chief Parham to talk about body-worn cameras. This is an area that we've had discussions on in the past. We talked about it briefly on our last panel, but one of our viewers asked during the last session, could body camera footage with permissions be used for scenario-based trainings? Is there any policy in place to evaluate an officer's body cam footage for interaction with the public, for use of force, or is the footage only looked at after a complaint happens or after a problematic interaction? So a number of questions there, but all tied into body cams and how they could be used and are used by law enforcement.
Yes, sir. So body cameras are absolutely a terrific tool that I think are completely underutilized. I think we have to admit that the majority of agencies that originally got body cameras got them because the public basically didn't trust what we were doing as law enforcement agencies. And their idea of transparency was really, we want to see. We know what you're saying, but we want to be able to see it. When we got those cameras, we started to realize, wow, there are tons and tons of videos that we just can't even look at because there's so many of them. We're just going to store them. And there, of course, there's evidence retention issues, and there are a lot of things that we need to think about. But we didn't look at the risk management side. We didn't look at these things as actually containing valuable data that depicted officer performance that we could look at to determine whether it was in line or whether it was consistent with best practices and agency policy. So as we move forward, the answer is yes. The working groups that we are on now under the Attorney General, we are looking at building into each of these groups an after action, a review process that looks at police officers' body-worn cameras to determine if they are actually doing the job the way they're supposed to do it, the way that they were trained, or if there are some anomalies. This is not a gotcha program. This isn't a let's see if you're messing up. This is truly, and I think every law enforcement officer on the we would much rather look at an officer who's going slightly askew and then straighten that person out to wait for some misconduct to happen and then have to discipline that officer. The benefit of reviewing the body cameras is to catch performance anomalies before they turn into misconduct, and to also ensure that the money that we're spending on training and budgeting and all these other things is actually being spent in the right places. Jokingly, we had there was a course that we used to send officers to when they were rude to people. And what we would do is we would find an officer and we'd send them to this course again and again and again and again. And we recognize that, well, wait a minute, we're sending them to a course over and over again, but we're ending up with the same level of performance. Well, that's maniacal. It's nonsense. What we didn't do is recognize that the course itself that we're sending them to may not have the effect, or maybe training isn't the issue here. Maybe this person doesn't need training. Maybe they need something else. The body camera will allow us to collect that data on the officer, on the shift, on the platoon, on the agency, and determine what successes they're having, what failures they may be having, what performance anomalies exist. And then from there, when we find the perfect behavior, the right behavior that officers are exemplifying, we then take those videos and we share them at the academy level. And we say, this is what right looks like. Because it's one thing to say it, but it's another thing for an officer and officers to look at the video and say, okay, I get it. The issue that we may have sometimes is the viewpoint. A lot of times the camera doesn't catch things in the right way, so we may need multiple angles, but that's something that we're working on. And we're also working on consistently applying key performance indicators to each incident type. So if you go to a mental health call, we expect you to do a certain amount of things. If you go to a traffic accident, we expect to see a certain amount of things. That predictability, much like the McDonald's discussion we had earlier, sets a parameter for officers and a consistency that the reviewers can look at and say, we want to make sure that at the very least, everyone is doing everything the same way. Body cameras allow us to do that.
If I could just add on to that too, General, as director, the majority of complaints that I received were demeanor complaints. And the good thing about body-worn cameras, not only does it protect the citizen from being treated unfairly, but it also protects the officer. When a demeanor complaint came in, I would have to send it over to the Internal Affairs Unit. It would cost us money and law enforcement hours to investigate that. If we had the body camera, those investigations were cut probably by 90%. And because what's on the camera is what actually happened. Subsequently, I worked with the former Attorney General, John Hoffman, when we developed the body camera program. And One of the things that we found to our research is when Evesham Township, they had a lot of problems with the community, police community relation issues. They had complaints against officers. It was a lot of issues that they were dealing with. Once they deployed their body camera program, those complaints went down by 70%. Complaints against officers went down drastically. Also, in addition to that, which is to me even more important, is that police community relations went up by approximately 90%. So some people will say, well, it's a costly undertaking, so are lawsuits at the end. So we have to make decisions as to whether we are going to be more proactive with our approaches to policing, or are we going to be more reactive on the back end when the damage is done and when the town has to pay millions of dollars. And not only that, the trauma that someone may have to deal with, be it a individual, a citizen, or the officer that's involved in that incident. And people respond differently when they know they're on camera. So we can prevent officers from getting hurt, and we can also make sure and be able to monitor, and as Jonathan said, be able to retrain people if they need retraining once we see that video. And if there's discipline needed after that, that will happen too, all the way up to termination.
Everyone behaves better when they're on camera. And to your point, Giles, you could either pay now or pay later. You're going to pay at some point, but it's one of the greatest accountability and transparency tools that I've seen over the last number of years. And as departments adopt them, I think, as you said, those numbers are pretty consistent statewide in every department. Q and Jonathan, were you trying to jump in? Q?
Yeah, I was just saying that also, okay, the body cams answer to complaints, but most importantly, the random review by the supervisors, the sergeants, that is key also. I think we found more on a random review of those footages than we have in terms of the complaints, because like Giles said, they know they're being recorded. Everyone's better on on camera. I always joke and say no one's going to pick their nose. They know they're being recorded. But guess what? When the supervisors every single day are looking at those different footages, I mean, right now we don't have body cameras, but we have dash cam, and the supervisors are required to do that. And since I've been here, they've been consistent, and they found those smaller problems which could lead to bigger problems, and that's important.
Jonathan, were you trying to jump in?
Yes, sir. One quick thing, we talk about trust in the community all the time. I think it's also important for us to talk about trust within the law enforcement community. When we have these things like body cameras and updated legislation and laws, we also have to recognize that the police officers need to trust that leadership is doing the best thing for the community and the best thing for the law enforcement officers as well. That's integral to making sure all of this happens. This can't happen to law enforcement, it has to happen with law enforcement. The body cameras are another thing that officers at some point were very, very critical of until they got them. We will also 30-second video where we've seen something happen and we thought, wow, that looks really, really bad. But with a greater context, we saw that maybe there's a greater justification for that. On the working groups that we're working on now, again, under the Attorney General, when we use body cameras, we are mindful to not look at a 30-second soundbite that frames the officer doing something without greater context. It's extremely important as we move forward that we don't take a snippet in time and try to attach that piece of body camera to the officer's entire career. So the trust certainly works both ways when we want to let the law enforcement community know that as we use this performance management, risk management tool and safety management tool, that we're going to absolutely consider the officer's perspective as well.
To your point, I remember when we first introduced body cams and they were a new thing, that criticism abounded across the state, that departments didn't want them. But now I hear in departments that have them and have a limited number, officers don't want to go out without them. They want to wear the body cams because of there's no gray area. You have what's recorded about a conversation or an interaction. You might not have every angle, but it's no longer totally a he said, she said situation. And to that point, our conversation today is about use of force. Under the new law that was passed last year, the independent prosecutor legislation, my office investigates every fatal officer-involved shooting or death in custody case. And there are those cases involving departments where there's no footage. And so that's a different type of investigation, and it's a difficult investigation. Not to say that the ones with body camera footage are easier, but they give you a much clearer picture of how force was used and what the justifications were or were not. And then importantly, if it doesn't rise to the level of something that's charged, certainly from a disciplinary perspective, from a training perspective, it's a tool that allows us to do so much more than if we had just the testimony of witnesses who saw what or testifying to what they remember seeing. This is an independent arbiter of what transpired during a particular situation. So I think it's an incredibly important tool. And I want to go back to Giles with this question because it ties into some of what you were saying and some of what we're hearing right now in the national conversation, where we have movements afoot to quote, defund the police, close quote. If you asked a number of people what that meant, you'd get as many different answers as people you asked as to what defund the police means. We need tools like body cameras. We need tools like the training that Q talked about on training management. We need to improve training in our academies. We need to improve training in service to review body camera footage. The price of body-worn cameras, as you know, Giles, is exorbitant. It's not so much the equipment, but it's the storage costs. So the question we received about defunding relates to the cost of body cameras, and the viewer asks, does anyone on the panel have anything else to recommend other than to say we need to fund this? Do you have a solution on how we could actually implement these things and address this funding and defunding debate?
Correct, and absolutely, and that's a question that a lot of people have. And one of the things that we were faced with when we initially launched the program. But at the end of the day, we're faced with a scenario, as you said earlier, you pay me now or pay me later. But what we need to perhaps look at is buying in bulk. When we buy in bulk, the cost comes down drastically. If there was one repository of all of this data that chiefs would also have access to if they need to for their individual purposes, I can tell you that cost would come down drastically. But if you do individual silos throughout the state, it's going to be more expensive by virtue of the work that's entailed to develop those. And not trying to get too technical with this, but at the same time, you mentioned defunding. And if you ask 7 people in a room, as you said, they'll give you 7 different answers. But at the end of the day, what we should be doing, I don't even like the word defunding. I call it, when people talk about it, I change the subject to restructuring. And what we need to do, we need to be analyzing our agencies every year, seeing if we're meeting our strategic objectives. And if we're not meeting our strategic objective, then maybe we do need to reallocate, reassess, and move things around and change the direction that we're going forward. But what I find, unfortunately, too many times is that we are not, especially in the public sector, we are not reviewing what we do every year, and we're not making those adjustments where we need to. Depending upon various different types of crimes that may pop up in different communities, we do this all the time. All right, this is not like this is something unique. We restructure on a regular basis. If we haven't, during the 90s, we had a lot of auto thefts in various different counties throughout New Jersey. So we developed auto theft task force teams. You know, we have to constantly evaluate the services that we provide to our citizens and also the different crimes that are occurring. So when you talk about defunding, I think we should more so focus on restructuring. Is it the best utilization of our resources to have police officers doing this type of work or this type of job? We never want to lose a connection with the community, but this is something we should be doing on an ongoing basis, looking at how we're allocating our resources and then measuring and finding out if we're getting the best outcomes.
You know, I think defunding the police, or however we frame this debate, as you suggested, is really not the answer to fixing the problems that exist in policing. Some of the things that we've talked about internally are data-driven solutions, matching the resources to the data, and also in order to sort of effectively address public safety. All of us have talked about this, and you mentioned it a couple of times, Giles. The fundamental question is, how do we prioritize our resources. And that starts with who's at the table when we start to redefine and reimagine policing and public safety. So this is a broader discussion aimed at making better long-term investments. There's legislative action also that's out there on body-worn cameras, and perhaps that'll have some funding tied to it, because we all know about unfunded mandates. If a legislature passes this bill requiring body cameras, it will get challenged unless they also provide for it for our local departments. So really a broad question, and perhaps one for an entire other seminar or discussion on how we could start reimagining what public safety looks like in our state. We're running up against the end of our time here. There's a couple of really short questions which I'll throw out, maybe in rapid fire to our panelists. I'll go to Q. Does New Jersey require local police departments to track the race of the people they pull over?
So right now, New Jersey in general, no, but we are, because we feel that it's an indicator, maybe not necessarily even of bias. It can be an indicator of certain training issues, the location where the stops are being performed, and those type of things. So I think, we go back to transparency. If you're collecting that data, you're evaluating that data, and you're looking at it, and it flags certain things, it forces certain things to happen, including more monitoring, supervision, and evaluation.
And this is an area where the state police does, and they lead on that. It's something born out of the consent decree, but it is a great tool for all the reasons that you just outlined. And we will, and we do when it comes to use of force. And so as we build out our database on use of force, we do track these trends, and they sometimes are indicative of patterns which we could address earlier when we have the data and that type of visibility. I'll go to Giles with this quick question. In the future, will a higher level of education be required for entry-level officers, such as an associate's degree in criminology instead of just a high school diploma in certain departments? Giles, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think I'm a big proponent of education and training, without a doubt. And we want law enforcement officers to be sharp. We want them to be smart, and we want them to present well. But I don't necessarily think that at an entry level into the field of law enforcement that we should require a bachelor's degree or even an associate's degree for that matter. But I do think perhaps what we need to look at more closely is what instruction are they getting in the police academies. Even if we have to extend the length of the academy, there should be a curriculum included in that academy that would bring that individual out of that academy training with at least 30 credits. They should be encouraged to continue their education within their department and get tuition reimbursement to support that, because policing has become very technical. And as you know, as an attorney, when you are presenting your case in court on the stand, you need to know the law and you need to be able to communicate that well.
Great suggestion on that combined education and police training. Jonathan, did you want to jump in there?
Yes, sir. I just want to add one thing that really affects that, and that's sort of the way the system has been set up for people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. Most people had nothing to do with where they were born or where they lived. And if you live in a poorer neighborhood, that usually means you go to a school that is substandard, and that's not an insult. It means that it may not be as good as other schools. If that's the case, maybe it doesn't prepare you as well for college or things like that, or maybe although you may have gone far, it doesn't compare as well to other schools. And the reason that I bring that up is to require entry-level officers to have a degree is dependent upon all the things that we just talked about: where they were born, where they go to school, what neighborhood that they live in, all of those things that really at that point don't have anything to do with law enforcement. If we're going to put a value on education, and I certainly believe that we should, it may not be at the entry level. Maybe it's that at year 3, year 5, you should have a certain amount of credits. You should continue to pursue your degree so that at the very least, along with the licensing that's coming up, that you have a degree after 3 years, 5 years, 2-year degree, whatever those things. And in order to go rise up the ranks, that you have a degree, that is commensurate with the level of position that you're trying to attain. It is extremely important, of course, to have an education, but to require it initially is literally denying a large portion of the population who never had the opportunity or the finances to get to that point. You're now restricting them from getting into law enforcement if we do that.
And which is a challenge we're trying to meet as we try to add to the diversity of our law enforcement agencies across the state. Q, go ahead.
Just one quick thing on that. Our department does not require a degree, but one of the great things is once they get here, they will reimburse them for college courses. So they can get their degree while they're here. I'm not lobbying for hiring, but it is a fact here. And I think some of the important things about general, I'm sorry, is that I think sometimes we look for the wrong things in law enforcement. There's certain characteristics that are more important that we sometimes minimize by having these requirements in terms of having a college degree.
Thanks for that. I just want to finish up on 2 points, and I'll give you an opportunity, Q, you, Giles, and then I'll wrap it up. I want to talk about really quickly a question about community policing. What are departments doing in Black communities where the divide and inequities in policing have systemic negative impacts? What are departments doing to build positive relationships and mending relations? And then Giles, if you could close out on your thoughts on police licensing and where we're headed in the state. And Jonathan, if you want to share a final thought after that, and then we'll wrap it up. Q?
Okay. So, and I don't want to get on my soapbox on this one, but we know that the inequities in policing do not start with inequities in policing. I mean, it's the financial institutions, educational institutions, social institutions. I mean, we just learned through COVID, health care as well. So I think that the bigger picture here, to curb some of those inequities, we need to look at the populations that are greatly affected by these inequities, and it trickles down to policing, because a lot of the problems start with social issues. It's not policing. But one of the things that we've started here in Franklin, we're launching our new Community Relations Bureau. It's going to be a combination of the PAL, the Boys Club, but geared at all age groups within our town, because we feel that the biggest time when you get that relationship to grow amongst populations of color is when you're not operating in that capacity as a police officer directly arresting someone or investigating a crime. So we want to start there with, rebuilding that positive relationship. And I think one of the big things I saw this week with the Youth Academy, when I went into the briefing room to talk to them, everyone's sitting up straight. And, I talked to them as myself, and they told the officers, like, oh my goodness, she's cool. I wish she was strict. We saw her walk the building. And see, they have to know we're real people as well.
Yeah.
Just
Giles, thoughts on licensing?
Yes, yeah, and just if I could just real quickly share too, one of the things about community policing, in order for it to be effective, and I like the word engagement, community engagement. In order for it to be effective, it can't be a program. It has to be a department-wide philosophy, and it has to be a sincere effort, and that has to permeate from the head of that department right down to the last officer hired. Getting to your question of licensing, I think we should have licensing, and I'll tell you the reason why. Policing is still, in spite of what's going on, is still a noble profession. And quite frankly, we make a livable wage. And many other professions as such that have a high standard, such as surgeons, such as lawyers, such as even barbers, they have a licensing policy. And what that licensing does, it number one, holds you to a certain standard and says that you are a professional. You are qualified to do this job. And then also what it does, it helps out other law enforcement entities. If we get a bad officer who should not be in policing, who probably should have never been in policing, that will let that other law enforcement leader know that this person is not qualified to serve in that capacity. And it also makes you, as an officer, maintain a certain standard also. We should also include in that continuing education credits to be a part of that standard. So what's all entailed in that, we can work on that, but there should be some sort of standards that we have to meet on an annual basis so that we can continue to provide and expand upon the services that we provide to the community.
It's a baseline level of professionalism, it's accountability, and then thank you for what you said on community policing. Community policing is more than just National Night Out. It's more than just coffee with a cop. It's a way of thinking, and it's a way of engaging with community members. Going back to the point you made at the outset, Giles, about getting input from the community, it's about building legitimacy. And frankly, in preparation for today, I was just reading a couple of things. And I went back to that 21st Century Policing Task Force report. The blueprint's right there. We should have been acting on it since that came out in the wake of Ferguson. Hopefully the momentum now will make those changes lasting, that those pillars that are outlined in that report will become the foundation of where we take policing in the future. And we are well on our way here in New Jersey. There's a lot of things wrong across the country, but in New Jersey, we get a lot of this right. And we just need to continue building on the great successes that we've had here. Jonathan, final thoughts before we take us out?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Two quick things. One, auditing, and two, outsourcing. Auditing, I think at least on a quarterly basis, every law enforcement agency should be looking at those antecedents to error. What are those things that historically lead to problems? Let's identify them. Let's put them on a risk matrix somewhere. Let's prioritize them. Let's start proactively looking for them so that we can get to them before they turn into misconduct. So that's the auditing part. The outsourcing part is that there are some things that we just don't do well. Now, I don't know of any law enforcement agency who doesn't have a law enforcement officer in IT. Now, I don't think that's a bad thing, but they didn't get hired for IT. They happened to be a law enforcement officer who liked IT, and that's where they ended up. So there aren't too many successful companies out there that take the person who's doing one job and shift them into an entirely different field where they have no experience. We need to look at outsourcing and hire professionals to do the things like hiring, to Director Spruill's point. When we're looking at hiring, we don't necessarily do that well, because what we're looking for is the person that acts and looks just like us. That's not necessarily a good thing. So auditing and outsourcing are two things that I think that law enforcement ought to embrace as we look towards, revamping, revitalizing, transforming our agencies. Thank you.
Thank you all for another meaningful discussion. Thank you for the great questions that were sent in for today's conversation. I know it was about use of force, but these are the questions we received, and these are the questions we wanted to answer. So again, thank you to Chief Parham. Thank you to Giles, and thank you to Q, and congratulations to Q on her new role at Noble National, and good luck with the swearing in this evening. As we close today's session, just let me remind everyone that we're in the midst of this revision process for our state's use of force policy for the first time in 20 years. It's a policy that affects all of us, so everyone should have input in the revision process. If you haven't already, go visit the website and the portal we set up at nj.gov. OAG/force, nj.gov/OAG/force. Share your experiences, share your thoughts, share your comments, share them by August 1st, because that's when we take down the portal. And we are going to take all this stakeholder engagement and revise our policies to align with our values and the realities we're confronting in policing in New Jersey and across the country. So again, thank you to everyone for joining us. We went a little bit over, but it was a great discussion. And we'll continue it in the future. Thanks to all for attending, and thanks for the panel. Take care, guys. Stay safe.
All right.